Hey there! Today we're looking into the second of 3 ways that you can add CSS stylings to your HTML document to create a website that is unique to you and looks nice for users. In our previous video on adding CSS to your HTML document, we went over the first way that you can add CSS to HTML, and that was using the style attribute on an HTML element, such as your p tag for your paragraph, your div for your containers, or your h1 for your first header, and all the other HTML elements. Each of them can have a style attribute in which you can list out each of your CSS properties, be that your font size, your font weight, your color, your background color, your margins, and your padding, all listed out in your style attribute separated by semicolons. In this video, we're going to look into a more advanced way that you can add CSS to your HTML elements in order to add styling. And it's a bit more advanced, but you have to learn it in order to get to the third level of advancement, which will be even better for adding CSS. So stay with me in this video, and in our next video, we'll go over the third way for adding CSS to your HTML in a more extensible and flexible manner, which you'll want to know as you learn how to build even bigger projects. Before we get to it, because it's very important, you're on YouTube, so you should know this is coming. I need you to like this video. I need you to press that like button. No, I need you to smash that like button, because I need to know if you're enjoying these videos and are finding use out of them, actually learning. And YouTube also needs to know that. So I need you to like the video and comment your thoughts below. Even if it's just to say hi to me and say thanks, I would appreciate that. It would help this video reach more learners and tell me that I should continue making more videos. And of course, that would help you because then you get more videos from me. So if you haven't already, go ahead and like the video below and subscribe to the channel and give me a comment. I would love to hear from you. Now let's get to it. So we're back here in our HTML from our last video. Again, this is how we added styles before. And if you look at our website, we can see that we have our styling in our first section. Again, only the first section is what we've styled so far because we've added the style attribute to these various elements within our first section. So that's the header tag, that's the paragraph tag P, that's the div container, which we made yellow or gold, and we have a styling on the image to add a border and make it 500 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall and have a round border. Again, we added all of these in our previous video using the style attribute on our HTML elements, directly on those elements. And as you can see, this is how they look. Again, not very pretty, but that's not the goal right now. The goal is just to understand how to add CSS to your elements and make them look unique to your website and in a way that actually looks good to your users. We'll get to that latter part later, but for now, let's look into how we can expand on this by adding more styling, more CSS to our document. Now, again, the first way was to use the style attribute directly on each element. And that's a fine way. We actually have moved away from doing that as much as we can. We avoid it unless there's performance reasons to do that, which you will learn later. But just know that this is not the preferred way to add styling in most cases. Our second approach gets us closer to our more preferred way of adding styling to our HTML elements, our document. So let's go ahead and try that right now. So what you're gonna have to do is remember that we have this head element here in our HTML document. This head element tells the browser meta information about the HTML document. It gives it more information about what this document is and what is contained within. And now we're going to see how we can use the head to tell the browser what other resources we need for our document so we can pull in more resources. And when it comes to adding styling to our HTML document via our head element, we can do that by using the style tag. We type style just like we typed title here to tell the browser what the title of our document is. We can now type style and tell it the CSS that we want to use in our HTML, the CSS that we want to apply to our HTML elements. So again, as we saw before, we can add styling to each element directly on the HTML element. But now we're going to see how we can add to the same elements using this style tag within our head. Now, let's say we want to add some styling to this H1, or welcome to ModernNerd Code header, which is right here. Right now, it has the default styling from the browser. The browser made it bold, and the color is black, and that's great. But we want to make it more unique to us. So we can go ahead again and do style on the HTML element, the H1, and say, let's make the color, let's make that green. Right? Or we can make it lime green because that's cooler. So let's do that. We'll make our H1 element lime green. And when we go back to the browser and refresh, we can see it's right there. Welcome to ModernNerd Code. The H1 header is now lime green. We can of course go ahead and make that red just to make that point clear. And let's go back to lime green. And then we can also go ahead and say we want the font size to be bigger. We want it to be 100 pixels. We want to go huge. We want our header to be huge. So look at that. Welcome to ModernNerd Code is now in huge text, 100 pixels big. That's great. We just applied some CSS to our H1 header to make it green and bigger. We can also even give it a background color and say, hey, we want this to be on black background. Look at that. Isn't that snazzy? Welcome to ModernNerd Code is now in lime green on black background. That's great. But what if I have a second H1 element? What if I go here and type a second H1 element? You wouldn't usually do this, but just for an example, what if I have a second H1 element and I want to say learn to code life? And we go back and we refresh, we can see our new H1 here. It's called learn to code life. We can see though that our first H1 still has our styling, but our new H1 doesn't. So again, when we use the style attribute on an element, it only applies to that element directly. So our new H1, although it's an H1 like this one, it doesn't have the same style attribute as our first one. In fact, we can go ahead and give it its own style attribute and say, hey, we will make our color purple. And now if we go back and refresh, we can see purple. And we can give ours a background of red. Purple on red. Not the best look, but there it is. Or let's just make it just be clear. Let's make it gray. Why not? Gray, purple on gray. So our second H1 element has this new styling using our CSS in our style attribute directly on that element. That's great. But what if I want my styling to apply to all my H1 elements and not just the one that I added my style attribute to directly? Now, that's where the style tag comes into play, because we can go into our style tag and say, I want to target every H1 element. And I can do that by typing the H1 element's name and then typing these brackets, opening curly bracket and closing curly bracket. So it's the opening curly bracket, is the closing curly bracket. And then I can go in here and type all of my CSS that I want. Again, in the same format, each key of a CSS property, followed by colon, followed by its value, followed by a semicolon to end that CSS property line. So let's do that. Let's say that we want to give all of our H1s extra padding, right? Make them wider and have more space around the text. So we can do that by saying padding is 20 pixels. Just as we did down here in our H2 element, we said padding for our H2 is 10. And if we go back and we see our H2 element here, we made a padding 10. In this case, we want our H1, all of our H1s, to have a padding of 20. So if we go back now, save this and go back to our browser and refresh, we can see that our H1s now both have padding of 20 pixels. If we want to be clearer, we can actually go ahead and just bump this up to 50, just to be clear. Save and refresh. We can see now our padding around our text within our H1 element is now 50 pixels on both of them. Isn't that wonderful? And of course, if I want to have this one be less padding, I can go ahead and type on it directly and say, hey, this H1 element, no matter what the style tag says, I want my H1 element, this one, the second one, to be 10 pixels. So we can go ahead and refresh, and now it has a padding of 10 pixels. So instead of the 50, it now has a padding of 10 pixels. And so we can stop there for a second and just go over some terminology. We've been saying CSS. What does CSS mean? It means cascading style sheets. The word cascading is important here. And for me, whenever I don't know a word and what it means, I like to go to my handy dandy friend, Google. So let's do that. Let's go to Google and look up the word cascading. Cascade, the second definition here is actually what we care about more. It means a process whereby something, typically information or knowledge, is successively passed on. And of course, we can look at the first definition. It's a small waterfall, typically one of several that fall in stages down a steep, rocky slope. This second definition right here, again, successively passed on, is the key. And this first one is good imagery, because you can imagine a waterfall where it falls down multiple levels. It goes down this level, and then it falls again. It goes down this level, and it keeps falling. So cascading style sheets work in that way, wherein if we define styling for an HTML element, it applies to that element and also its children. That's why, again, the first part was that it applies to all of those elements, in this case, our h1 tag. Because we applied it to our h1 tag right here, all of our h1 tags are going to get this 50 pixels. However, if a specific element says that I want to override what I have been bestowed upon, I can do that. So even though someone higher said that I should have 50 pixels of padding in my CSS, I inherited that, I want to override that. I don't want 50 pixels, I want 10 pixels. And so that's what's happening here. We start here at the top of the waterfall with this h1 style tag, and then we apply to this first one that gets 50 pixels for its padding, and that works. We can see that here, 50 pixels. But then we come to this one, it would also get 50 pixels, but we said instead, hey, I want to have 10 pixels. I don't care what the person above me said, I want 10 pixels. I don't care what the style tag says, I'm gonna override that. But then, if we go to our container in our second session, we can actually go ahead and say, I want all of the text in my container to be a pink color. And so if we go ahead and refresh our browser, we can see that our second header, our h2 element here, now has a text that's pink. Let's make that a different color just to be clear. Let's go with blue and refresh. We can see that it's now blue because the parent, again, the top of the waterfall, said that I want myself and all of my children to have blue text. But the child can then go and say, hey, I don't want to inherit the blue text. I don't like blue text. That's so 1920. I want to have lime green text. I want to say I want my color, my text color to be lime green because that's better these days. So now my color is lime green. But if there's another h2 or some other element, its text will be, let's just give it some example. And if we refresh, we can see it still has the blue text color because the parent has now cascaded its text color down to its children at every level. So it's cascading, right? But we can see that this div doesn't define a style for itself or its children. And it also isn't a part of this div up here because you can see these are two separate trees, two separate elements. There's this div with a color of blue, and then there's this div that has no styling yet. And it has children, and one of the children is h2, and it says where to find us. If we go back to the browser and we refresh, we can see where to find us is not blue because it's not a child of this div up here. Only this div and its children get its styling, gets to cascade its styling down to its children. So that's how cascading style sheets work. That's why it's called CSS, cascading style sheets. And that's very important, so keep that in mind. But before we move on, if that was helpful, if that helped you understand how cascading style sheets work, what CSS means, do me a big favor and like the video below because I need your support to grow this channel. Let's help me get to 200 subscribers. Now, let's continue. Okay, so let's see our website again. We can see that we have all of our elements here in our first section styled. So let's keep adding some styling. We started with our style tag that now has an H1 element targeted. What this is called a selector. We're selecting the H1 element. We're telling it that it should apply these CSS properties to all the H1s. So we select an element and we tell it which CSS properties to have. And then the browser cascades that throughout the HTML document. And that's how we get this. So we can see that now all of our H1s should have a padding of 50 pixels, unless, of course, they override that. So let's add some more. Let's say that we want all of our H1s to have a margin of 20 pixels. And save and refresh. We can now see that they have a margin around them of 20 pixels right here. You see this 20 pixels right here? Right here. Let's increase that just to be clear again. Let's go with 70. And if we refresh, we can see that they now have a margin that's on the outside of them that push them away from other elements or from borders. They now have a margin of 70 pixels right here, all the way around on both sides, on all sides. That's how we target a specific element, all the elements of this selector that match the selector. So the browser is going to go through and look at your style tag and say, okay, you want to target the H1 elements? Okay, I can do that. I'll find all the H1s. There is one here on line 12, and then here's another one on line 15, and I'll apply all of the CSS that you tell me to, the padding and the margin, and I'll apply that to all of them. So let's say that we want to tell the browser that we want all of our H1s to have the styling that we had in our first H1. Let's go ahead and take that style tag out because we won't need it anymore because we have the H1 targeted here. And we can put all of that styling right here to apply that to all of our H1 elements. So if we go ahead and save and refresh, we can see that we still have our first H1 element, welcome to the ModernNerd code, has the same styling as before, but now also our second H1 has the same stylings in some of its CSS properties that it hasn't yet overridden. So we can see that it's now the font size 100, and that's pretty much it because the rest of its styles are overridden. We can see background is similar to background color. You can also have a background image, but for now, background and background color are pretty much the same. When we get into more in the future, we'll see how background is a little different from background color, but again, for now they're the same, so you can use them interchangeably. So let's just get that back to background color. We can see that our second H1 has overridden the color right here, the background color, and the padding CSS properties in its style attribute. So it doesn't get all of those from the H1 selector in the style tag. And if we go back to our code, we can see that it has a padding of 10, it has a background gray, and it has a color of purple because that's what we have here. If we go ahead and take out this purple right here for the color property, we can hit save and refresh and see that it's also lime green now because it's getting that from this H1 selector in the style tag in the head of the HTML document. And so it's getting that applied because it's an H1 element and we're telling our document that we want all H1 elements to have these CSS properties. We can do the same for background color. We can take that out, save, and now it has a background of black because again, we targeted our H1 and told it all the H1s to have a background color of black. And that's exactly what's happening because this is an H1 tag. It also now has a background color of black. And last but not least, we can go ahead and remove the padding 10 if we want, or we can keep it. It's up to us. If we want to have all of our H1s be exactly the same, we can go ahead and take this out. But if we want this specific H1 to have a different styling than all the other H1s, then we can go ahead and keep it. So just to show an example of what I mean, if we go ahead and make a third H1 and say, this is everything you need to know about coding. This is our third h1 tag in our HTML document, our third h1 element. And now it also doesn't have a styling attribute, just like our first h1 element. So if we save and refresh the page, we can see it here. It matches the same styling as our first h1 element because it also doesn't have a style attribute, and so it's getting all of its styling from the h1 selector in the style tag within the head of our HTML document. And this tells it what the styling should be. So all of this goes to all of these h1 elements unless it's overridden. So we can see that our first and third h1 elements have paddings of 50 pixels because that's what we wanted. And if we change this now to say 100 pixels of padding, we can see that they have 100 pixels of padding. But this second one in the middle here, Learn to Code Life, still has a padding of 10 pixels because it's telling the browser that, hey, I don't care about the other h1s. I am different. I want to have my own styling. I want 10 pixels for padding. But if it decides to change its mind, then we can take this out. It now has no styling of its own, no unique styling, no style attribute on the element itself. And so if we save that and refresh, it now looks like the rest of our h1 elements. Looks exactly the same now. If we want to change our mind again and say, hey, we want this to have a border of 3 pixels solid red, we can do that. Now it has a border of 3 pixels. Let's make that bigger so that we can see it clearly. 30 pixels solid red. It now has that styling. And we can add a border to all of our h1s if we want, but we can make it 20 pixels solid yellow. And if we save, we can see that both of our h1s, our first and third, have yellow borders, solid yellow. But our middle one, our second one, still has red because it said, I want my border to be 30 pixels and red. So that overrides whatever is defined in the style tag and for this h1, for all of our h1 elements. I'm belaboring this and repeating this over and over because it's very important that you understand the relationship between the style attribute directly on an HTML element versus a selector within a style tag in the head of the HTML document. The higher up the styling is in the HTML document, the further it is away from the HTML element, and so it has less priority. So if there is a style attribute on an HTML element, that's going to take priority every time over what's in the style tag. So I want you to practice this, just play around with it and see how it all works together. Okay, so let's say we want to apply more styling to other HTML elements in our document. We don't have to just do one per the style tag. We can actually add all of our CSS in here. So now if we move on to, let's say, our h2 tags, again, we have one here that says example, we can go ahead and target our h2 elements and say, I want those colors to be pink. Let's do pink again. I like the color pink. So let's do that. So if we go here, we can see that all of our h2s are now pink. Look at that. Isn't that wonderful? And we can go ahead and say we want the font size for all of our h2 to be 30 pixels. And if we refresh, we can see that they're now 30 pixels. All of them are all 30 pixels big. We can make that bigger just to be clear, 60 pixels, and we can see they're now 60 pixels. So all of our h2s are now 60 pixels, including this example. So let's go ahead and take away this example h2 because we don't need it because we have enough h2s. And let's go ahead and make this a better color. Let's choose one here. That's a better pink or purple, whatever. And save that and refresh. We can now see that all of our h2s are this hot pink or whatever purple color that is. And they have a font size of 60 pixels. And we can go ahead and actually give them a border underneath to separate them from their content, the rest of their sections. We can say we want a border on the bottom of our h2s, all of them, and we want that border to be 2 pixels solid gray. And we refresh, we can now see that they all have 2 pixel solid gray borders on the bottom. So you can see that this is border bottom, which is different from border, because border goes all the way around, border bottom just goes for the bottom border. We can do top as well if we want. Instead of bottom, we can do that right there. Or we can do the left and refresh. We can see it right there. Or we can do the right and refresh, and we can see it over here. So why is this border all the way over here away from this text? That's because this H2 spans the whole width of the document. It's 100% of width. So we can actually see that right here. If we go ahead and type width and then do 100%, that's what this is by default. H2 header elements are 100% across. The same with div elements. So if we want it to not be 100%, we can go ahead and say, I only want my H2s to have a width of 50%. So now it comes down here. Or we can say, hey, I just want my widths to be the width that it needs to be to fit the content. So fit content right there. All I need my width of my H2 to be is enough to fit the content that it has, to hold the text. That's all I need. So let's go with that. I like that better because we don't want our border all the way over here. So let's go ahead and put our border on the bottom instead of the right, now that we know how width works. And refresh, and it's there. We can also, just to be clear again, we can also give it a background of gray. Why not? And now we have a background of gray. But let's go ahead and say light gray, just so it's a little different from our border. And we can see it has a light gray background and a regular gray border on the bottom side. And just to be clear about the width, if we remove our fit content width right here, property, we can see that it goes all the way across. But we don't like that. We don't need it to go all the way across. So let's go back and type again. Width equals fit content, semicolon. And now we have our width property. And it's back. Perfect. Let's add some padding because the text is touching the borders. I don't like the edges. I don't like that. So let's just add a padding of 20 pixels all the way around. And go ahead and save that. So now we can see our text isn't touching the borders because I like spacing. So we can see a padding of 20 pixels all the way around our H2s, and all of them have that now. Again, we can go in and say that we want this specific H2 to have its own style and override whatever is in the style tag up here. So let's go ahead and make the color of this one. Let's make that I don't know. Let's make it red. I'm not very creative with colors. I'm sorry. It's now red. What we offer is now red because we told it that its style should override whatever the default is in the browser and whatever we've defined in our style tag using this H2 selector. Again, a selector is the element's name right here, the tag name, followed by a opening curly bracket, followed by the CSS properties that we want to define, followed by a closing curly bracket. This is how it is every time. You don't get to choose how you define CSS properties. This is how you must do it every time. This pattern, you have to follow the rules of the language. So you cannot do it however you want to do it. You have to do it this way. So just remember that. So that's how we can target a type of element. But in a future video, we'll learn more ways for targeting elements, such as using this ID or using a class that we define using our CSS style tag that we now know how to use. So there's a lot more to learn, but I think this is a good stopping point because we now know how to define these selectors and CSS properties for a HTML element type. So our H1 or H2, of course, we can do it for our Ps, for paragraphs. We can say, let's make all of our paragraphs have a background of red. And we can go ahead, save that, refresh. We can now see all of our paragraphs have a background of red right here. These are all paragraphs. If we go ahead and make that a different color, we can see that it's there. All of them are turquoise now. So we can target any HTML tag name, all of them within the document, and give them styling that we want to apply to all of those elements of that type. And we can do that using our style tag. We don't have to apply styling directly onto the HTML element each time, because that can be very slow and inconsistent. If we want to make a design that is consistent, we want all of our H1s to look this way, we want all of our paragraphs to look this way, we want all of our containers to look this way, we want all of our links to look this way. Let's actually do that. Let's make a selector that targets our links, our anchor tags, which is A. So we can make all of our links be color blue. Let's actually make all of them light coral, because why not? And we can make them all a font size of 20 pixels, and we can make them all a font weight of 600, and we can give them a text decoration of underline. If we go ahead and refresh, we can see that all of our links are now a light coral. They have an underline, and they have a font size of 20 pixels and the font weight of 600. We can go ahead and change that to 300, refresh. We can see they're now thinner. They're not as thick, not as heavy in weight. Or we can say, hey, we don't want underlines under our links. We can say instead, we don't want any. Let's do none. And now there's no underline under our links. They still work. They open up our links, our URLs, as we wanted them to, right there. But now they look the way we want them to look, not the way the browser makes them look by default. So again, we can take this away, and now our links will now all have an underline by default, because that's what the browser does. But if we want to override what the browser does by default, we can type text decoration, none, and now there's no underline. So you can go ahead and play around with this. Try to add styling to more HTML elements. There's div, there's the whole body. You can actually add CSS to the body. Let's actually look at that real quick and say, hey, our body element should have a background of light blue. Why not? And you see, it's now light blue. The whole document has a background of light blue. Look at that. Or we can say we want it to be green yellow. Let's see how that looks. A little loud. I don't like that as much. So we can do that. We can say, let's make it white. Let's just keep that white by default. So go ahead and play around with this. We now know how to add styling to our elements using the style tag within, again, the header. It must go in the header between the opening head and the closing head. So that's how you can add your styles to all of your HTML elements, by selecting their HTML tag name and then defining the CSS properties that you want within the curly brackets, opening and closing curly brackets. In coding, if you open a symbol, you must close it. So when you see an opening and closing bracket, that's how it has to be every time. If you see an opening and closing parentheses, that's how it has to be every time. If you see an opening tag, HTML tag, you have to have a closing HTML tag. That has to be the case every time. You can see it here. This pattern, it follows through all of coding. So keep that in mind. You see the opening title tag here and the closing title tag, the opening style tag and the closing style tag, and then all of the contents within those opening and closing tags. So the style tag must be within the head, and all of the styles must be within the style tag. So go ahead, try that out, add some styling. It's like you're back in 2004 playing with MySpace, adding CSS, adding your own HTML look to your MySpace profile. That's exactly what you were doing back then. You were writing CSS code. You might have not known it, but that's what you were doing. And now you understand how it works. So go ahead and play with it. See what other CSS properties are out there and just play around. See what you can do. Maybe make your page look how you want it to look. Make it look cleaner than this. This is pretty ugly, but it helped us understand how CSS works. So I really hope that was helpful. And if it was, do me a big favor and like this video and subscribe to the channel and comment your thoughts. Even if you just want to say hi, I will greatly appreciate that, because that helps the YouTube algorithm know that you are enjoying this video and you want others to watch it too. And of course, you can share it with a friend. So if there's anything that you don't understand in these videos, just go ahead and Google it. And if you want to learn ahead before our next video, go ahead and Google. If you get stuck, just Google HTML. How do I add this property to CSS? HTML, CSS. How do I make my background a picture? See if you can add a background image. That's my challenge to you. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Lincoln, and I'll see you in the next one.